For more than 50 years, women's wrestling was controlled by a singular figure, the fabulous Moolah. But despite being synonymous with women's wrestling for decades, a dark cloud has hung over Moolah's legacy thanks to reports of sex trafficking, SA, exploitation, extortion, and an unchecked ego from various women's wrestlers she was training. But is this the case of an innocent woman being unfairly accused of heinous things by hordes of lying women? Or is this the case of a woman who used her power to abuse women's wrestlers for decades and never got a comeuppance for her injustices? Today we're gonna find out. This is the life and crimes of the fabulous Moolah. Fabulous Moolah, real name Mary Ellison, was born in 1923 just out of Columbia, South Carolina, as the youngest and only girl of 5 kids. Her mother passed away from cancer when she was only 8 years old, leading her to be raised by her father and her brothers. The death of Moolah's mother affected her deeply, and even 2 years later, she was reported to still be distraught over the loss. As an attempt to cheer her up, Moolah's father brought her to the local wrestling matches. It was there that Moolah first saw Mildred Burke, the independent women's world champion, and fell in love with wrestling. And so, in her late 20s, she decided to become a wrestler, making her debut in 1949. During this time, women's wrestling was treated mainly as a sideshow and was not taken seriously, so Moolah struggled to get bookings and make a living for herself. Despite all of this, she was slowly building her name in the very limited women's wrestling scene. Though never the most athletic wrestler, Moolah knew how to keep the crowd engaged and knew how to work as an effective heel, notoriously working very stiff and pulling her opponent's hair. After relentlessly grinding and making a name for herself over the years, she finally got a big break in 1956 when Vince McMahon Sr., who headed the Capital Wrestling Corporation, invited Moolah to participate in a 13-woman battle royale to crown the NWA's Women's World Champion. The match took place on September 18, 1956, and Moolah was the last woman standing and claimed her first championship. She would go on to hold this title for a staggering 28 years. Moolah ruled over women's wrestling with an iron fist and actually purchased the rights to the title in the 1970s. She even changed the face of the title belt to include a picture of herself. After she became the NWA's Women's World Champion in 1956, her stronghold on the women's wrestling industry began. Moolah and her husband Buddy Lee formed Go Wrestling Enterprises, and Go Wrestling Enterprises became the premier promotion business for female wrestlers. Moolah invoked strict rules for the girls that trained under her. She insisted that their hair and makeup was always to be done and that none of them could date men associated with professional wrestling. Moolah helped pioneer the crowd-pleasing style of women's wrestling that would dominate the industry for decades. Moolah also began to close off women's wrestling as she amassed more power and control over the sport. As the sport's champion and its controlling booker, Moolah typically would only wrestle and defend her belt against women who were part of her promotion business. This not only ensured her spot at the top of the industry, but also began to secure her place as one of the most powerful promoters in all of wrestling. If you're a woman who wanted to become a wrestler, and especially if you wanted to have any success within the industry, you had to go through the fabulous Moolah. The considerable level of control is where some of Moolah's darker accusations begin to take shape. In order to begin training under Moolah, women had to pay her a training fee, which was reported to be around $500, which in today's money is about $4,000. The trainings were reported as some of the most intense that wrestlers could endure. Typically, training would occur for 5 hours per day and took place in Moolah's barn, which lacked any air conditioning and was very hot. Despite taking this training fee, many of the women have reported that Moolah didn't actually do much of the training for the wrestlers, instead leaving those duties to some of the more experienced wrestlers in her stable. Those wrestlers who did lead the intense training sessions, however, were never paid any extra for their work. The girls were also required to live on Moolah's compound in Columbia, South Carolina on Moolah Drive. The wrestlers were given a strict curfew as well, with Moolah reportedly locking the gates after a certain time, and if wrestlers weren't home by then, they were locked out until the next day. On top of the training fee, Moolah collected $300 per month in rent, which would be around $2,400 in today's money. Basically, she was making a killing. Moolah also controlled the bookings for her girls and took a 25% fee off the top of whatever they made in their matches. Of course, even that 25% fee was disputed, as Moolah would first subtract their travel and food fees, and some wrestlers reported having a 30% booking fee with Moolah. Regardless, because Moolah was the one receiving the checks and not the wrestlers, they had to take Moolah's word that she was only taking 25% of what they were being paid. All of this led to many of the female wrestlers being in financial debt to Moolah. One of Moolah's trainees, Debbie Johnson, claimed that she worked for Moolah for over 2 years before ever making any money. This also meant that Moolah had a considerable amount of control over the careers and lives of the girls who trained under her. Not only did she control their financials, but she controlled when, where, and how often the girls would work. And if you weren't in Moolah's good graces, then you weren't getting booked. Moolah also made sure to flaunt some of this manipulation of playing favorites in order to get the attention of her wrestlers. A wrestler named Princess Victoria claims that she once received expensive, jewel-encrusted ring gear from Moolah as a Christmas gift, which was given in front of everyone to make the other girls feel jealous. In addition to the financial abuse, many reports have emerged over the years of Moolah partaking in pimping of her trainees as well. In the 60s, it was common for many promoters to insist the female wrestlers perform personal services before they were paid. Moolah reportedly encouraged this behavior from her trainees. Many of the women who trained under Moolah have told similar stories. A wrestler named Mad Maxine claimed that Moolah would often send trainees to a man in Arizona in order to make some extra money in lewd ways. WWE women's legend Luna Vachon also claimed that she was sent by Moolah to be lewdly photographed by an older man when she was only 16 years old. One of the more vivid stories of abuse was told by Princess Victoria. After she broke her neck in the ring in 1984, Moolah continued to have her take bumps for 2 months to see if she could still wrestle. When it was made clear that she wouldn't be able to take a booking for some time, Moolah arranged for her to meet a man in Holland to make some extra money. Moolah allegedly told Victoria, "If you're nice to him, he'll be nice to you," and reminded Victoria that she needed to start bringing in some money in order to stay on the compound. Victoria traveled to Holland, but fought off the man's sexual advances, which enraged Moolah upon her return. Moolah allegedly took back Victoria's ring gear and kicked her out of the compound with nearly nothing to her name. She then lied to the other wrestlers by telling them that Victoria was taken to jail for dealing coke. Wrestler Penny Banner labeled Moolah as a pimp and a sex trafficker and accused her of specifically sending out female wrestlers to fornicate with promoters in exchange for money. She also likened the photo shoots Moolah would book for her underage talent to pornography. Sandy Parker, who was a lesbian, claimed that Moolah forbade her from visiting gay bars and even pressured her to date men instead to help her image. This was seen as hypocritical from Moolah, however, who was alleged to have had affairs with women's wrestlers. Vivian Vachon has even claimed to have witnessed Moolah fornicating with some of her female trainees. So basically, to get on Moolah's good side, a lot of her trainees were willing to engage sexually with her just so that they can get bookings. The worst of these offenses, though, was the plight of a wrestler named Sweet Georgia Brown. Brown was the first African American wrestler from South Carolina, and like nearly all the women's wrestlers in the 50s and 60s, she trained under the fabulous Moolah. Little was known about Sweet Georgia Brown until 2006, when an article was released in the Columbia Free Times. There, Brown's daughter told of the abuse her mother reportedly received at the hands of Moolah and her husband, Buddy Lee. Brown claimed to be told to drink and take drugs, and was SA'd by men frequently. Her family told of Brown consistently returning home pregnant with another child after her time on the road, and was even rumored to have been impregnated by Buddy Lee. Brown would eventually leave the industry in 1971, mentally and physically exhausted after years of abuse at the hands of Moolah and Lee. On the wrestling side of things, in June of 1984, Moolah would sell her rights to the NWA's World Championship to Vince McMahon Jr. for a considerable price, and in doing so, she agreed to compete exclusively in the WWF. This meant that Moolah transitioned into the very first WWF Women's Champion. Soon after, Moolah would become a key player in the WWF. At the time, music star Cyndi Lauper had begun a rivalry with wrestling manager Captain Lou Albano, garnering a huge amount of mainstream interest. The rivalry would build to a women's championship match at the Brawl to End It All on July 23, 1984. The main event match, which was featured on MTV, pitted upstart Wendy Richter, who represented Lauper, against the fabulous Moolah. In order to gain favor with Vince McMahon and likely for a hefty price tag, Moolah agreed to take the loss in a high-profile title match to Richter. This would end Moolah's nearly uninterrupted 28-year title reign as the women's champion, but she wasn't quite ready to leave the spotlight just yet. Moolah already had a contentious relationship with Wendy Richter. Richter had trained under Moolah in the past, but quickly became disillusioned by the financial control Moolah was holding over her. Richter eventually joined WWF, insisting that McMahon give her the checks directly instead of Moolah, effectively cutting Moolah off from her money. Moolah evidently wasn't a fan of Richter, and this led to WWF's original screwjob. On the back of her partnership with Cyndi Lauper, Richter was acquiring massive mainstream appeal, and McMahon envisioned turning Richter into the female version of Hulk Hogan in terms of popularity. This started to become problematic though, as Richter wasn't being paid nearly the same as Hogan, and she began to use her status to push for more equality. McMahon decided that he had to get the belt off of the disgruntled Richter. On November 25, 1985 at Madison Square Garden, Wendy Richter was scheduled to defend her title against a masked opponent, the Spider Lady. Richter claims that she saw Moolah backstage before the match and was surprised, as Moolah typically didn't appear at any show she wasn't booked on. Her story then changes a bit. Sometimes, Richter claims that she had no idea that the woman who came out in the Spider Lady's mask was actually the fabulous Moolah, but other times she claims to have immediately known who it was. The fans, of course, were chanting Moolah at the Spider Lady from the moment she entered. Regardless of whether Richter knew or not, Moolah quickly went off the script once the match began and forcibly pinned Richter's shoulders to the mat. Richter kicked out after a count of 1, but the referee continued to count, awarding the title to the Spider Lady, who unmasked to reveal herself as the fabulous Moolah. Feeling betrayed, Wendy Richter would leave the WWF that night and never spoke to Moolah ever again. Moolah had a lot of control backstage, and she even forced her way into the CBS animated series Hulk Hogan's Rockin' Wrestling. Originally, Mad Maxine was set to receive a huge push from WWE and to be a character on the show. But Moolah, who controlled Maxine's bookings, never told her about the plans and began to refuse to book Maxine on any of the shows to tank her popularity. Maxine would leave the WWF shortly after, and Moolah ended up being the one on the cartoon show. As time went on though, Moolah's influence eventually began to fade. More and more women were now getting employed directly through WWF, which meant that they no longer needed Moolah to get booked. Moolah left the WWF in 1988 and retired from the ring soon after. She would form the Ladies International Wrestling Association in 1980 and would actually return to wrestling in 1993 for the promotion. She continued training wrestlers throughout the 90s, including training male wrestlers, and in 1995, the fabulous Moolah became the first ever female inductee into the WWF Hall of Fame. Moolah returned to the WWF in 1999 alongside Mae Young and became a regular comedic act during the Attitude Era. Moolah even won the WWF Women's Championship one more time at No Mercy in 1999, becoming the oldest champion ever at that time. Moolah would go on to set another record, becoming the first 80-year-old to wrestle a match on WWE television when she defeated Victoria on an episode of Raw in 2003. Moolah struggled with heart issues as she got older, and on November 2, 2007, the fabulous Moolah passed away at the age of 84. In 2018, the WWE announced that WrestleMania 34 would feature the fabulous Moolah Battle Royale. The match would highlight 20 women and the winner would be awarded the fabulous Moolah Memorial Trophy. Almost immediately, this decision spawned backlash from the wrestling community. Stories of Moolah's alleged abuse began to come out into the mainstream, and many people pointed out the hypocrisy of honoring Moolah during a period of time dubbed the Women's Evolution. As part of the original announcement, the WWE also described Moolah as a trailblazer for women's equality, which again raised eyebrows when you consider how hard she worked to keep herself at the top of the industry. That very night, a Change.org petition was started online, demanding that WWE change the name of the Battle Royale. Within hours, the petition had nearly 10,000 signatures. The WWE initially tried to push through the negative reaction, but when one of the main sponsors of WrestleMania 34, Snickers, got involved, the WWE couldn't ignore the situation any longer. With the majority sponsor expressing their disappointment, they changed the name of the Battle Royale to the WrestleMania Women's Battle Royale 2 days later. WWE managed to survive the controversy, but the real damage was done to the legacy of the fabulous Moolah, who had her allegations go truly mainstream for the first time. The legacy of the fabulous Moolah is certainly a complex one. On one hand, she is inextricably linked to the history of women's wrestling, and her popularity and efforts helped lift bans on women's wrestling in various pockets of the United States. She also, in one way or another, trained a generation of wrestlers over many decades, but unfortunately, the damage that Moolah did on the industry is just as significant to her story. Because of the influence she wielded, Moolah could have made things far better for the next generation of women's wrestlers. Instead, her and her husband took advantage of poor young girls who were just trying to get into the wrestling industry. Moolah left a path of destruction in her wake. Countless wrestlers left the industry due to the financial and sexual abuse that they endured. Opportunities were taken away while one woman held the belt for almost 11,000 days. The fabulous Moolah affected many lives negatively, and all of this and more was because Moolah had to be at the top of women's wrestling at all costs. The fabulous Moolah is one of the most despicable women's wrestlers in wrestling history. Another is Juana Barraza, who was a wrestler that became a serial killer that killed 48 victims. If you want to watch that video, click the video on screen now. Thank you for watching the video.